Welcome. We're going to get started here in just a minute doing a little introduction. We've got a lot of people joining the webinar. If you turn off your video, then no one will be able to see you. And if you leave your video on, then you'll join in kind of the audience here. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us this Monday. We are about to get launched here talking about hiring in a tight fundraising environment in the space industry. I'm going to give us just a minute or so here as people are being admitted from the waiting room. Play some elevator music to entertain us as people are joining. I still see some audio connecting. Welcome, welcome. For the people here just joining, if you've got you're welcome to keep your cameras on. We love to see your faces, love to see people engaged with the content. It's great for us. And if you don't want your camera on, then you'll disappear completely from the screen. So we've still got people joining and audio connecting, but it's about 2 minutes past. So we'll get started here. We're gonna get started with an introduction of who we are, and then we're gonna launch into this material. We're talking today about hiring in a tight fundraising environment in the space industry. We want to talk about fundraising from private capital to non-diluted funding through government contracts and how this affects the hiring priorities and process for early stage startups in the new space industry. And I here today talking about this, we've got myself, I'm Seyka, Brian, Mejeur, and Justus, Kilian, and we are all space fanatics. We are incredibly passionate about space and about space startups. We have very differing backgrounds that bring us to work together on supporting startups in all that they're doing and furthering the industry as a whole. So my background is in talent acquisition. I've worked at a variety of different perspectives in talent acquisition, both with large legacy nationwide organizations and very early stage startups. And I'm currently the CEO of AdAstra, where we work on executive and highly technical placements for space and clean technology startups. I'll pass it off to you, Justus. A little intro for everyone.
Sure. Thanks, Seyka. So my name is Justus Kilian. I'm a partner at Space Capital. We've been investing in this category for over 12 years now. And before that, between my partners and our operating partners, we've been building systems, focused on space for almost 30 years. So I have a lot of experience in this category and believe that there's really a long-term opportunity. We focus on the earliest stages, partnering with founders and teams to help take on really challenging problems and help grow their business. And so one of the reasons it's so fun to work with Brian and Seyka is capital and talent, particularly at the early stages, work so closely together. You need money to go out and hire great people. You need the equity to be able to incentivize them for the long term. And so they're inextricably linked. And so that's why we have these series of conversations to be able to talk about how those two things tie into each other. So
Thank you. Brian?
Everybody, my name is Brian. I'm our COO, CTO of AdAstra and Seyka's husband here. So we already did a bit of an intro about what we do at AdAstra, but my background's in aerospace engineering. I got my bachelor's and master's from the University of Michigan. Did some internships at SpaceX and elsewhere before working at SpaceX as a propulsion engineer for about 4 years, and then was at an early stage startup doing operations work before starting at AdAstra. So I bring a little bit more of a technical background to the conversation, and have had a blast working with early stage startups on their hiring over the past 5 years with AdAstra. And so I will kick it back to Justus to have us get going here.
great. Well, that was just a quick transition. We want to dive in. So we are in an environment where capital has been constrained. And I want to give sort of a state of play, particularly sort of coming into the second quarter end to help frame private capital flows and also think a little bit about public funding. So, you know, we publish a report every quarter. It's called the Space Investment Quarterly. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend taking a look at it. It helps look and understand how capital flows impact, space companies. So for this audience, I think we're probably mostly focused on that infrastructure, the hardware, the rockets and satellites that are being built. And so I pulled some early data to help us frame this conversation. And while it's still early, it appears that the second quarter is going to show a bit of a slowdown in space infrastructure investments quarter over quarter. And when you annualize those figures, it actually looks like we haven't seen this low of investment. You'd have to go all the way back to 2019 to see similar investment levels. So it is a more capital constrained environment. But we are seeing a lot of deals happening. And so it's been actually relatively consistent, over the past 5 years, the annual number of investments that close. And so what that suggests is there's just smaller amounts of capital available to work with. And we're seeing a really significant drop off for growth stage companies, Series B, and in particular, Series C stage companies. It's very hard to raise additional growth financing. But there may be signs that that's changing. So in this past quarter, ISI, Apex, PLD, ISAR, Expo all closed growth investments. And that's a very positive signal for the market. That's across the United States and also, across Europe. And so, within our portfolio alone, we saw over $250 million in capital raised. So, that's an important signal in terms of hiring. Hiring tends to lag capital. And so, within those companies, you should see additional hiring over the next probably quarter or two. Shifting focus on the public funding, there has been an increasing importance of space being reflected in the Department of Defense's budget, with in particular space investments growing at a 20% annual rate from 2020 through 2023. And this really is due to a convergence of technology, national security interests, and economic priorities that are sort of aligning around political will around space and defense. And so this capital is flowing into sort of three major areas: space domain awareness and digital infrastructure, hardware, logistics, and physical infrastructure, and then launch capacity, whether that be tactically responsive or creating more of space superiority. So there is additional public funding going into those specific categories. Commercial space companies have shown that they can rapidly build gaps with critical wartime infrastructure. So SpaceX demonstrated this with Starlink's deployment in Ukraine. And this is helping drive multiple efforts to increase the number of SBIRs that are available and programs of record that are being awarded to these new companies. And so it's really important that, these companies are able to grow into large contracts. And that is happening really on the back of that track record of success. And then recently, the Space Force budget approval came in at about a 10% increase year over year. That's not, that's about $1 billion less than they actually requested, but it's still, very meaningful growth. And so then the last thing that I'll do is sort of tie that together, how that funding is then fitting into talent, which I run a platform called Space Talent, which looks at the jobs in the universe that we cover. And so we've seen the number of open roles cut in half since Q1 of 2022. So a huge drop off just in terms of total number of hiring that's been happening. But the total open roles over the last 18 months have actually been quite stable. And over the last 2 months in particular, I've seen about a 13% increase. So we are seeing, that capital translate into open roles. And so that was a lot of context. Brian, I want to sort of shift that over to you in terms of what you're seeing then in terms of the fundraising landscape and government contracts and grants.
Yeah, thank you, Justice. That was incredible insight. Thank you for all the work you and your team do to put all this information together and share it with everyone. It's a real gift to the industry. And actually, you have a dashboard for this too, right? That you can review all this data and like filter it and all that fun stuff, right?
We do, yeah. SIQ, it's live data. It gets updated every quarter, and you can filter it and segment it, and so you can get really specific. So if you want to take a
Yeah.
look at it, it's free. All this is free.
Yeah, highly recommend that to everybody. It's a really, really incredible tool. I think what we're seeing mostly on the talent side is the shift towards more hires and leadership in the both business development and even in the operations space as well. There seems to be this understanding that these checks are smaller, and so the amount of capital is less available. So companies seem to be going after these government funds even more aggressively, which makes sense. Still highly competitive. Like there is more, maybe a little bit more government money, but I think the competition for that government money has gone up so much since there's less capital available from the venture side of things. And so what we've been hearing from venture capitalists or companies raising their rounds is a lot of interest in who's leading your business development efforts, who has these contacts, who knows how to close these contracts, and let's make sure that you're on a path to closing even more of that business, or you have the right people in the seats to be awarded those contracts, because the dilutive funding is just less available. So they want to see, seems like there's a lot more need for stronger traction for non-dilutive funding. And I think similar to that, we're also seeing more need on the operations side. I think that we want companies to see that they can run a tight ship and be more capital efficient. And so there seems to be a much stronger demand to have the right COO in place or the right director of operations, whoever that may be, to be really effective with the capital that you do have.
I think those are, astute observations. Yeah.
Have you seen anything that goes against that in the work that you've done, Justice, or is that pretty, does that track pretty well with what you've seen so far?
There's a higher bar in terms of technical credibility and um, validation for companies before they're able to secure funding, and therefore then hire additional roles. And so it is important to have a strategy when it comes to securing government contracts. And so I think what the benefits of developing this in-house and pursuing it and hiring, from my perspective as an investor, what it's providing me is a couple things. So you have technical validation in terms of, what you're actually doing and how you're thinking about it, and, an expert reviewing some of, your thinking and your approach. So that is positive as an investor. It helps me diligence an opportunity. The second is that there is some sort of market validation and there's some need for what you're doing. And so, particularly at the early stages, both of those things are positive signals to investors. There's a risk here that you get distracted from your core product development and sort of prioritize R&D. And there is a long history of firms that literally just sort of specialize in R&D for government needs, and they build a whole bunch of sort of patents and one-off solutions, but never are able to scale. And so it is a risk, and you do need to think about it intentionally. I think there's also a risk that you're not able to move between early SIBRs, because the DoD wants to see clear commercial demand, or dual use capabilities in addition to sort of their own internal needs. And so you don't want to get stuck only serving government as a customer. You have to be simultaneously thinking about sort of the dual use nature of this. So one organization that has spun up to help solve this problem, helping early stage companies, well, actually companies of all stages, navigate Space Force funding is an organization called DTI. They're based in El Segundo. They have a location called The Bridge, and it's Space Force's nonprofit arm to help private companies navigate government contracting. And so, even as they're looking for proposals and sort of scoping of those needs, they host discussions to help shape what those, public-private partnerships could end up looking like. And then they actually will help you develop, strategies for contracting with the government and not get pigeonholed in some of these areas that I've mentioned. So just some tips and sort of, an investor take.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting too what you're talking about on having like how do you align your technological roadmap to these different types of funding and how that's shifted? Because I think a few years ago when venture capital was pretty cheap, a lot of money being thrown around. I don't know if you had to worry as quickly about product market fit. You could really just focus on the tech and kind of grow your tech quickly. And now it's like, okay, these checks are smaller. We can't just like throw a bunch of money at talent and hardware. We also have to be designing something or building something that fits with the revenue streams that are available now in these non-dilutive funding sources. But sometimes that funding or oftentimes that funding does not match like your career, the trajectory of your company. And so I think that's where a lot of the work comes into play for these early stage companies is how can you find the right contract that basically still takes you in the direction you are going and just gives you an extra boost of capital, instead of going in completely different directions just to chase a little bit of money. And I think that can be really tricky for folks.
Yeah, I heard an important statistic that of the roughly $1 trillion DoD budget annually, the programs of record, the companies that have been awarded programs of record, so the large government contracts that are under 60 years old is something like, something under 10%. Or another way to say that is the startups that are competing to win big contracts with the government are a very small fraction of, that budget. And that really needs to increase. And there are things that are happening on the government side, but it does require a lot of intentional effort from the company and, critical business development hires to make that happen. So maybe that's a good shift, Seyka. It'd be great to hear sort of your take on growing demand for business development professionals, within these startups and how to prioritize them and how to think about hiring for them.
Yeah, thank you. Guys, this is so interesting. You have been flowing and I'm just coming up with questions to ask. That is so fascinating. And the first thing that comes to mind hearing what you were just talking, that statistic that you were just mentioning is, I mean, it's like beating everybody in the face right now. The juxtaposition of government contracts awarded by NASA to Boeing versus SpaceX, right? Where SpaceX got a little over half of the money that was awarded to Boeing, and SpaceX, though not a startup in 2020, right, was working on that for many, many years up until 2020, which is when they had their first successful launch of their, essentially when Boeing and SpaceX are competing to be able to ferry astronauts to the International Space Station, and just how relatively very young company in SpaceX was able to do that for literally billions of dollars less. And so looking at SpaceX looking at startups competing for these government contracts and going, what are we going to be able to make happen if we're able to get kind of diversity of thought, diversity of perspective into solving these novel issues, and how much farther can our money go if we're able to do it for less expensive. Obviously, this is a much more complicated than that put so simply. And there's a lot that goes into these complex technical issues, but it's an interesting example to look at there. So yes, sorry that I just really got taken by that. So fascinating looking at that. So We are seeing we're seeing a large uptick in startups looking for business development leaders. So this is not somebody who's going to be doing some business development. This is somebody who is going to be, a highly strategic individual driving the organization, and specifically looking for people who are excellent in business development and understand how government contracts work. It's a key piece of these roles that we're looking for. So there's like a major trend in that also. For our audience here, one of the questions that came in ahead of time was specifically asking, hey, for early career business development individuals wanting to break into the space industry, what do you recommend? So listen up, this here is for you. It's a very appropriate question for what's happening in the market right now, and startups are needing to prioritize this expertise early on and insight into how NASA works. So people who have had experience working with NASA, working with space organizations, working with government contracts are able to navigate now. So a highly desirable experience is someone who has worked inside a government organization, understands how it works from that side, and is now wants to bring it out and work as the partner from the startup's perspective, really understands the ins and outs of how things work and is able to navigate that. We're seeing a big trend that picking up.
I mean, I would go so far to say that there's a boom for this role, particularly,
Yes.
government-led BD sales. And if you have a military service in your background, that
Yep.
can be a very strong benefit. And if you've worked in the government helping craft some of these bills or legislation, and are coming out of an administration, and are just a great salesperson, that combination is highly desirable. Almost every company in our portfolio had been hiring for one of those roles, and it's very competitive to fill those positions because there's just not a ton of people with proven track record in that area. So yeah, I don't know how long that'll last. Hopefully it doesn't last forever because you need to have not only government-led sales, you need to have your private sector, your commercial orientation teams that are building sort of that go-to-market as well. So you can't rest your whole business development strategy on it, but people are willing to pay a lot for those key hires at the moment. So maybe it'd be helpful if I touch on just a few observations in terms of a strong BD team and how it can impact a startup's ability to secure contracts and government contracts and private funding. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, I think that sounds really interesting. Please.
Okay. So, these government contracts, including SBIRs, like I said, can be an important proof point in terms of, market demand and technical validation for a company. And so with my investor hat on, like that is sort of how I'm looking at it. I would say, very early in the company's life cycle, often a founding team, they're the ones that are actually building the company and sort of building the vision. And so they often lead that business development work, right? You're so inextricably linked to like product development, company, vision and sort of founder-led sales. But we're seeing a shift earlier in sort of business, life cycle to bring in strong BD teams and commercialize earlier because investors are looking for that in terms of their revenue milestones. And so just a clear example of what that means. In the past, getting from seed to Series A funding required on average, and this is general across SaaS and many, but the generally accepted milestone was 1 million in high quality revenue. And so that's typically recurring from a customer that wants your service. That threshold has now shifted almost 5 times to anywhere from 3 to 5 million in revenue at the same milestone, Series A. And so what that means is the number of companies that are successfully going from seed to Series A and graduating and growing their business at a high clip is dropping. And so Carta put out some good data recently that talked about, it used to be about 20 to 25% of companies could graduate from C to Series A. More recently, particularly in like hardware, it's dropped to like 13%. More SaaS-based companies down to like 7 or 8%. And so that increased bar means that you really have to prioritize and demonstrate sales very, very early on. So building those teams earlier, I think can bring incredible value to the company. And it's important to find the right person that sort of intersects with, the product roadmap, the company's roadmap, and can work alongside the technical team to make sure that you're filtering the right pipeline to fit with that. And investors ultimately value that if you're able to see it. Investors will discount those SBIRs as sort of temporary R&D funding, and it's sort of more of a one-off nature. So founders and sort of leaders of companies should look at it as sort of transitory, and not really necessarily a validation of the company or the business model, but a good way to subsidize sort of the early R&D and get the company going.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and so interesting to hear how the benchmarks have changed, and we're really kind of grading these companies on different scales. I think it might. We're gonna run out of time. I have so many interesting questions I'm itching to ask, but it'll take us off on. We've got some cool stuff that we want to cover. So, yeah, but I'd love to hear a little bit more from you, Justus, on the like looking at how these startups that you're seeing, the contextual information you're seeing from SpaceCap about how your portfolio companies are hiring in this new kind of landscape.
It's an interesting market because it seems, so in 2020, 2021, everybody was, there was a war for talent, and everybody was sort of throwing resources at hiring. And so that meant working with, outside recruiters. It meant, building a really strong team in-house. It meant willing, to put equity into compensation packages that, maybe a little bit higher or off market. What I've seen is almost all of those things have reverted. And so companies are more looking internal, more relying on their networks to hire, and compensation is getting a little bit more competitive. And for me, that actually I think is a bit of a red flag, because in all of these cases you're wanting to think long term, and so all of those sort of decisions are a little bit of a reversion towards we have a little bit more sort of influence and power in the market, and so we can sort of just rely on our network. And oftentimes, when you recruit purely from within your network, you get a lot of people that are very similar to the people that you already have. And, it could create a lot of groupthink. It can create some real challenges culturally if that's the only way that you're recruiting. I think, if you're not properly incentivizing people and the market starts to get more competitive for key talent, then people are more willing to jump ship. And importantly, that equity compensation, that equity package over the longer term, you want critical hires and team members to see the long-term vision of what you're building, and understand the value of the equity compensation and be working towards that over multiple years. Hiring somebody, bringing them on for 6 months, 12 months, you're just not realizing the value within the organization that you could. It's really important to try to keep them 2 to 3 years, if not more. So in my opinion, I think it's really important to not try to skimp on these things, work with really thoughtful partners. I mean, AdAstra is a great example of that. They are, a really deep partner that wants to expand your networks and deeply understand your needs, and will represent you as well as you could to, really incredible talent. And so oftentimes the best people are not actively looking for jobs. They're in great roles, they're in great companies, and they need to be convinced and sort of sold on a new opportunity. And that's where, Brian and Seyka are really incredible. I don't know, do either of you guys have any thoughts on this?
Thank you so much for your words and vote of confidence. It means a lot to us. Thank you very much. Yeah, a lot of thoughts. I think that you made some really great points. Often space is tends to be a hub for very mission driven people that are both driven by the mission of the startups that they're at, the mission of the space industry as a whole, and advancing humanity's technologies and abilities to, you know, reach other planets, interplanetary excellence. We often pay less than a lot of the big tech companies that are out there. A huge portion of what makes the work really kind of make a life work is in equity. So as equities turn down in these compensation packages, and if we're already reducing compensation, the thing that kind of keeps me up at night is getting people out of our industry. We are always thinking about how we can get people into our industry. How can we bring people here? And so when I look at compensation packages decreasing, becoming less competitive, that's one of the things that really stays on my mind, because if you leave space for too long, it becomes really difficult to get back in. People are looking for fingerprints in space when they're hiring at startups, and they need someone who's able to do high reliability, safety critical work very, very quickly without skipping a beat. So that's one of the things that's on my mind. I think yes, groupthink and having too similar of people that are being hired is definitely one. Another thing is not taking the time and energy to find technical talent that's really difficult to find. This is a small industry, and in a lot of ways, a lot of people know a lot of the same really cool people. There are some incredible professionals out there who are just a little bit under the radar, and they're harder to find. And when not as much attention is being given to hiring in a climate like this, then those people kind of don't get brought in, don't get brought up on those lists, and companies miss out on some really spectacular talent. So I know we're over time, but could talk about that one forever.
I think we might actually be going till 12:45 Pacific. Is that right? So I think we
Really
have a few
Yeah, we
more
gave
minutes this
ourselves
amazing.
time.
more time after
Yeah,
the
we did
last
30
round.
So
minutes,
Yeah.
30
smart.
minutes last time, so 45 this time. Um,
Beautiful.
yeah, I'll piggyback off of some of what Seyka was saying there. For one, like this demand and interest in getting folks from outside the industry is huge. Um, we see people talking about this all the time, and it's really, really important. Um, we're looking into what that could, like how AdAstra could support that in a bigger way. So just a quick like little plug. If anyone knows someone out of the industry that wants to make it into the space industry but doesn't have the work experience, or already 3, 5, 10 or more years in the industry, I'm looking to talk to some of those folks and collect some information to help us hopefully build something to address this. So we'll drop that in the comments here. And yeah, I think there's a big opportunity for that, and it's really necessary in the industry, because it is a very small industry currently, and so there's so much network hiring, there's so much in-group, out-group, group think, stuff like that. And so I do think that is really, really important. Network hiring can be really, really valuable, can be really fast, can be really effective. But that should only be one arm of how you're hiring folks. Um, yeah. And then Justice, I also wanted to circle back a little bit, and I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but could you speak a little bit more to some of the pros and cons of getting these seeking these government contracts, more the dilutive versus non-dilutive, and what you advise to these startups on how to balance those two things and when to go after the different types?
So raising venture capital funding is the most expensive form of financing your business that there is. We as investors coming in at pre-seed all the way typically through Series B will end up buying anywhere from 15 to probably 25, 30% of your company, depending how risky the state of the business is and how much capital you need. And so that's a lot of dilution in terms of you, the founder, and your key hires they're taking every time you help finance, the growth of the company. The great thing about non-dilutive sources of capital, whether you're working with NASA or DoD or National Science Foundation or many of the other sort of SBIR programs that are out there, is that one, there are programs that can actually match the equity financing that you're getting. And so as a part of your Series A, if you raise $15 million, you could get matching funds from the government. And that would be from a non-dilutive perspective. So you can literally double the size of your round for, no extra dilution. So that's a really smart way to approach it. The other way to approach it is just very early on. That is when any sort of financing is going to be the most expensive. You have two people in a garage tinkering, building something. For you to raise $500,000 or $1 million to, prove, sort of an early prototype, you're going to need $1 million and you're going to sell 20% of your company, maybe more. So, you can do that using government contracts and preserve, your ownership in your own company. And it's just a smarter way to finance your company, but it's also providing validation from a customer segment, in terms of a market need or a use case of the technology. And it's providing some sort of technical vetting, technical diligence that is valuable. The challenge with some of that, we've highlighted some of the challenges, which is, it can sort of get you off of a product roadmap and sort of lead you down other challenging paths. I lost it. I had it. I had another specific.
Even that happens.
Yeah. Um,
maybe I can toss one over to Seyka and you can come back
go
to
for
that
it.
when you got
I'll
it.
come back to it. Yeah.
What do you, or this for either of you, what are some of the more emerging skills? Like we talked about business development, we touched on operations a bit. What, maybe in 1 or 2 years, what do we think the emerging skills will be that are in like high demand for the space sector? This was a question that someone submitted for us.
You're asking us to project out 2 years for emerging
Just
skills that we're seeing?
what's our next webinar gonna be about? What are the next like what is the market gonna demand? Like I think one that shows up for me, for example, is how will AI and machine learning integrate and find its way into the space industry in a bigger way, right? I was talking to another investor a week or two ago, and I was like, yeah, our, AdAstra is mostly focused working with hardware companies. And like we do software work, but it's usually at a hardware company. And he's like, oh, well, aren't all hardware companies software companies? Like, isn't every company gonna be like an AI machine learning company in the near future? And so that got me thinking some more about how the industry is going to shift in that way. I don't see a ton of that happening right now, but it's only a matter of time, I feel.
I think there is, we've seen the industry become more software centric, and SpaceX has proven the value of that. Sort of borrowing the iPhone model, the ability to push, updates and, adjust your hardware on the fly. I think we will become increasingly, software enabled. And so, one of the biggest positions that you find across space companies is software engineers. They are a critical role now, and I think most people don't really realize that. But it's one of the most commonly required roles for any company. So I think it will increase with AI. You're seeing that already in sort of all the way from the engineering design to the testing, the use of digital twins to the data that we're getting from actual, flights with starships, the most recent flight 4, how quickly that gets embedded into an iterative build process. So I mean, AI will just turbocharge that. It'll just make our ability to use that data quicker, faster, and easier. And then hopefully with robotics, we can, and different types of manufacturing techniques, we can increase the ability to do, hardware development, manufacturing. So there will always be need for people to, sort of monitor these things and keep close, guardrails on it. But I think, we can move faster, quicker. So I don't know. I throw out, a need for this area in terms of hiring. I wish more companies prioritize would be marketing hires. I think brand and marketing is just really undervalued. Every company names themselves, something space. We get it. You're working on, a problem associated with space. You don't need to put it in the name of your company. And, I think there's also a challenge in telling the story of like what space is, why it matters in our daily lives and how it impacts, many major markets here on Earth and why that's valuable. I think people sort of see it as something that's maybe a little bit more niche and doesn't impact every major industry on our planet. So it's important to be able to tell that story. And then it's also important to be fun. I think, the industry has taken itself very seriously for a long time. And, the ability to embrace, failures. SpaceX has done a great job of this, highlighting and promoting what you learn from, designed, failures to, improve and move faster, sharing what we've overcome personally, individually to get to where we're at. I think those are all really important things. And so that ability to tell stories is super important. And it actually goes back to sort of a critical need within any founding team when we're looking at investing in early stages. The ability to tell stories and connect, what you're doing to the people you're hiring, to investors, to even your suppliers. Is mission critical to building a business. So I think that's a very undervalued and underrated skill.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's something that we see all too often as well, is the technical founders who have these really great ideas, they know the tech really well, but can they bridge that gap into the business side, into storytelling, into inspiring people and not expecting them to get it right away, right? I think that's where some of the gap is, oh, I get it. I'm talking to another engineer. They should get it. Or maybe you're not talking to another engineer. How do you speak the language? How do you get them to get excited about it and assume that there's going to be some roadblock there? Because a lot of people have great ideas, and it's not every great idea gets the money and gets the people and then gets it done. So I think that's really, really powerful. Um, Another question or two that from the registrants earlier on that we can combine a couple. And this circles back a little bit more, kind of a little off topic, but coming from other industries, coming from other backgrounds, is there diversity of perspective? What are some of those core skills, um, or are there any like programs like what can people be doing now if they want to be getting into the space industry? What are the things that matter when we're evaluating them or our clients or portfolio companies are evaluating them for a role in the space industry?
Seyka, you should take this one.
Yeah. It's a great question. My answer pretty differs a lot based on kind of what level of an individual is asking, right? So someone who's been in a different industry for 10 years have got pretty different information to someone who's maybe studied something in university that doesn't directly direct them into the space industry, but they're incredibly passionate about it. For the latter, definitely finding ways to get a mentor that's in the space industry, somebody who you can go to with very specific questions and not kind of going to them and asking them to lead you through, but going with very specific questions and to gain guidance from them. Finding organizations that you can do internships with so that you can get your hands on the material and you can see how these companies really work in person. For people who are looking to make a transition into the space industry, finding ways that you can work on the material that you work on in a space environment. So what I mean by that is if you're a software engineer, you are going to want to find out the very specific areas that your expertise is lacking for the roles that you would be interested in, and find material on how you can study up on specifically that. So it would be very compelling to go to a hiring manager at a space startup and say, I have got transferable skills from my industry, XYZ here, look at my resume. I know that I'm lacking in these areas. I haven't had safety critical, high reliability expertise. It just hasn't been required in my jobs. But because I'm lacking this, these are the courses that I'm going to take, and I can apply myself to learning that in this method, right? Show up being able to say how you're going to fill in for that skills gap, so that you're not kind of saying, hey, I think I can learn it, and putting the onus on the hiring manager, the company, to figure out how to teach it to you, but taking true ownership in figuring out what's missing and how you're going to go about filling that in.
I'm just going to throw out,
yeah,
I'm going to throw out three things that typically sort of come across my plate when I'm looking as an investor, things that are valuable no matter what stage of your career they are. The first is, having like a track record of sort of building, like just go build it. If you're a tinkerer, just, go out and start building something. Build that portfolio, be able to tell why you're doing it and show that you're able to do it. So that's really important. The other thing, people always say, go find a mentor. What is the company that you think is, the apex player in your area, and find the three people that are senior in an area that you're interested in and cold outreach them on LinkedIn and tell them why you admire them, like why you admire what they do. One of those will likely respond to you. It may not be a formal mentorship, but it'll be somebody that is willing to have a conversation. This is the same, like companies often do this, with me as an investor, they start that conversation early. The other thing is proactively think of what these companies, their problems that they're facing. And if you're outside of industry, you probably see a problem that they don't even know they have yet, and be proactive in, solving that even within your own mind, and start then using those relationships that you're building to help them see problems, show that you're a valuable partner and that you bring a different perspective. And that can be a really powerful way to, one, create a company that's disruptive, but two, create a role for yourself in a company that, may not see you as valuable.
That's excellent.
These are really good. I think that kind of combining a couple of things you both were saying is, you can say, oh, I'm a quick learner or something like that, but how do you prove that to somebody, especially in a different industry they don't know? And the way to do that is by building something and being able to back that up, right? Maybe it's at your job, maybe you can find a way to like own something really important and own it end to end, right? One thing that SpaceX did very well, and the culture that's permeated from SpaceX, is this like extreme ownership idea, the responsible engineer, like RE model, where one person owns the entire thing and they're responsible for it end to end, design, test, analysis, manufacturing, the whole bit. So where can you, if you want to work at a company that has a similar type of culture around hardware development, where can you do that? If you can't do it in your job, find a hobby outside of work to do that, and like bring that to the table to show that you can make that jump, because that's just as big of a gap, I think, for most hiring managers as like the actual experience working in space.
I'd encourage hiring managers to take those candidates seriously, because they're clearly self-starters, self-motivated, and really going to solve problems. And look a little bit outside the box. I think that can be a little bit hard for some people, but it can be worth taking those risks.
Yeah. And because if you're on the candidate side and you're saying, oh, no one's taking a chance on me, you're probably not bringing them enough evidence. Like anyone can say anything. You have to like bring them proof and evidence, and that speaks for itself so strongly. And I don't think many candidates are doing that well.
I also just want to echo the point that you made, Justus, about going after the people you're interested in partnering with and giving suggestions on how to solve the problems that they're likely running into, right? Putting yourself out there and showing that you do have a diversity of perspective and that you're really interested in getting into it with them. solving the problems that people are working on goes a long way in getting them to appreciate and remember you. So yeah, great idea. Great idea. Well, we're over time here now for real. So thank you so much, Justus. Really appreciate your insights. And Brian, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. This has been a joy. Thank you to all the participants and audience for being here. And we'll take note of the questions that you sent this time. You'll be able to see another webinar coming out soon, and we will highlight. You'll have another opportunity to send in your questions before that as well. Wonderful. Thanks, y'all. Have a wonderful Monday.
Thanks, everybody.